Hello again and welcome to the Genestealer cult video. So we're coming up to the year anniversary of the main Codex release of the Genestealer cult, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to do a more up-to-date review of the faction. So when the Codex came out, I was extremely excited. I've been sort of riding the cult high for a while, seeing a bit of a sub-faction. I was really excited for them to get their full Codex release, and for them to get the full tips and tricks and to be able to finally compete with the main factions of 40k. And so when the Codex first dropped, there was a lot of excitement, and I was really positive about the faction. But a year later now, we've had, the excitement's died down. A lot of people have experienced Genestealer cult, both used them and been against them. And so people, so now we have a much clearer idea of what Genestealer cult are like as a faction, both to play against and to play with. And so the thing, with the cult are still quite a niche faction, and there's quite a small community. I'd say that the Genestealer cult are one of the smallest communities in Warhammer 40k. That I've not come across many other people that play them. I know one other person that collects them in my area, and he's like me, been always interested in these guys. And then I've faced them once or twice at tournaments, and I've used them once a couple of times at tournaments myself. But whenever I've used them, I've been like one of the only Genestealer cult players there. Whenever I've faced them, it's been one of the only Genestealer cult players at the tournament I've faced. They're not a hugely popular faction. In fact, I would actually say weirdly they're more popular. For a while, they were more popular competitively than they were casually, which is almost the opposite for any other faction. So, where are we now a year on? Now, what I'm going to do, guys, is just to caveat this so people know, I'm not going to use this as an example of what a Genestealer cult like in comparison to Space Marines, for example. It's not going to be that kind of video. It's not going to be a Space Marine round. This is going to be very much focused on Genestealer cult, but I will have to touch upon the competitive scene to give a full in-depth analysis. So, upon their initial release, Genestealer cult made a big splash. They were a faction that could do mass deep strike, they could pull off a lot of shenanigans, and they had a lot of tricks. And those tricks allowed the competitive players to pick them up and bamboozle other players that hadn't faced them before. Because the first time you face Genestealer cult, you've read about them and maybe watched a couple of battle reports, but until you actually face them, it's very difficult to truly appreciate the tricks and shenanigans of the army. And most of the time when I face someone with my cult for the first time, I've tended to win. I've tended to actually do extremely well because the opponent is left reeling from all the tricks that I'm just pulling out from my sleeves. But that's the key word here, guys. It's tricks. And so what's become relatively apparent with Genestealer cults, that once your opponent has got used to facing them, and once your opponent is aware of your tricks, your shenanigans, Genestealer cult actually become quite easy to counter. With any Imperium faction, with the inclusion of a loyal 32 detachment for 180 points, can almost entirely hard counter Genestealer cult, which sounds crazy, right? But we'll get into why that is the case in a moment's time. So that's what I would say is the big issue with Genestealer cult at the moment. What's facing Genestealer cult players is that we're a faction that's based upon tricks and shenanigans, but that will only get you so far. It's kind of like when I remember. This is slightly off on a tangent, but I remember back in the day when I used to listen to Day 9 doing his StarCraft tactics. And like I said, some of you may get who that is, some of you may not. But he was a YouTuber. He did some Day 9 tactics, and he was explaining about how what makes a difference between a good player and a bad player in StarCraft. And what he said is a good player will use strategies, and a bad player will try and use like a Rambo trick. to beat someone, like something totally wacky. And the totally wacky thing, and the thing is, a totally wacky thing might work the first couple of times because the players that they're facing off against aren't expecting the wackiness. But inevitably, once you've faced off against that trick once or twice, you know how to beat it going forward. And so the bad player gets frustrated because he thinks, why isn't my trick working anymore? But that's the thing, it's a trick. It's short. I'm getting bored of saying that word now. The point is that it's got short-term effectiveness. Okay, and when you have an entire codex which is based upon shenanigans and being tricksy, it means that when people get used to facing you, they can quite quickly come up with ways of countering you. And Genestealer Cult do have some, unfortunately, real hard counters, which we'll get into now. Okay, so the thing with Genestealer Cult is their number one weakness is being screened out, and it absolutely cripples the army if your opponent screens out effectively. Because Genestealer Cult, traditionally, the majority of their strength has come from being able to deep strike close to the enemy, and with really deadly close combat units, and just tear the enemy to pieces, and do huge alpha and beta strikes to the opponent. But the problem is that Genestealer Cult used to have the exemption to not being able to come in turn one. Then that got taken away from them, and that was a real blow to the army, because then you could only come in turns 2 and 3, and that meant turn 1, the majority of your assets, half your army is off the board, and so you're not able to. You're playing in the first turn of the game. You're playing in a 1,000-point game against a 1,000-point army versus a 2,000-point army. And which means you don't really have the ability to really effectively remove your opponent's screens. And turn one, very important. You appreciate it's turn 1, you don't have the effectiveness. Then turn 2 comes in, and this is where people start saying, well, you have the Acolyte Handflamer Bomb. Absolutely, the Acolyte Handflamer Bomb is a fantastic tactic that the unit that the Genestealer Cult have available to them. It's essentially you take 20 acolytes with hand flamers. It's only 160 points. They each get D6 automatic hits, and they've got and they can potentially do that twice. Because what you can do is you can deep strike in, you can do lying in wait, so you're only 3 inches away, and then you can use a perfect ambush. So then you can fire when you drop in, and then in the shooting phase you can fire again. And so you've got, from one 20-man squad, you've got 2 rounds of 20 D6 strength 3 shots, which is really good for removing screens. But just to put that into context, that's 160 points. Now, the problem with when I say put into context, let me point out the flaws with the Handflamer Bomb, which is you're spending 160 points on shaft clearance, and the problem is that that's 40 guardsmen, and Handflamer bombs will struggle. I mean, you can string them out and that you can do things, but Handflamer bombs will struggle to be in range of all 40 of those guardsmen, because the guardsmen can string two 10-man squads out, and then have the other 2 10-man squads just behind, out of range, because the Handflamers have only got a 6-inch range. So even though you can appear 3 inches away from your opponent, with the with the stratagem lying in wait, the opponent only has to have the next screen of 20 guardsmen, or whatever, guardsman equivalent, 3.1 inches behind. So well done, you 20 hand flamers, men. Absolutely murderize 20 guardsmen. 1 level of screen, that's 80 points. And I've seen it happen. I've done it. When people say, "Oh yeah, but you can't charge afterwards," when you use that strategy to get your hand flamers, you can't charge afterwards. So I'm not gonna lay the point. My point is that with relatively simple screening, you can neutralize the big threat of the Genestealer cult. Because what happens is your hand flamer bomb comes in, clears the first wave of screens, but you've then your second wave comes in and of reinforcements, and you've got to be in combat at that point. What if the enemy has multiple layers of screening? Which most armies have the capability to do that. I, as a guard player, guard being a relatively common faction, everyone, if not pure guard, then everyone's got a loyal 32 or a rusty 17 or something similar. Multiple layers of screening, and then you're struggling. You're trying to make long bomb charges. And last thing to say is, to do that tactic once requires you to use 5 CP, I believe, because you have a perfect ambush, which is 3 CP, and lying in wait, which is 2 CP. So if you, some people say, what about taking 2 Acolyte Flame Bombs? You could do, but that's 10 CP. Even if you're running triple battalion, you've only got 8 CP left at that point, and most people don't run triple battalion. Most people run 2, which means at that point you've got 3 CP left. And that leads me on to my next problem. So not only have you seen like Genestealer Cult have tricks, and these tricks can be countered, and I've only touched upon one example. I'm trying to keep this video concise. I'm trying to keep it tight. This leads me on to the second thing with Genestealer Cult, which is you can be countered by screening, and your screens, and you've got these, rather than tactics, you've got these cards you can pull out, these tricks you can pull out from your sleeve, and those all rely upon stratagems. Nearly all your cult tactics rely upon stratagems. And I know some people were saying, but don't most codexes lean heavily on stratagems? No. Amazingly, no, they don't. Take the Imperial Guard, for example. You can go an entire game running your Imperial Guard without using a single stratagem. And with Codex stratagem, you can just use some rerolls and some auto-passing leadership checks. In the Guard Codex, there is I don't want to say no, but I can't. I'm sure someone will have their entire army based around one stratagem. But generally speaking, you don't have entire armies which base their entire tactic around their stratagems. What the Guard players do is they base their entire strategy around unit combinations, and then if they need to, they have some stratagems to add a little bit extra. But whereas in Cult, what you do is you have your units which are only functional because of stratagems in the Codex. For again, the Acolyte Bomb. But to use a different example, because we don't want to lean on the same example over and over again, you have the Demolition Biker Bomb, which is where you take 5 Atalan Jackals, which are the bikers, you make them Rusted Claw, and you drop them in 3 inches away, because you can do that, and then you use, which is 2 CP, and then you use extra demolitions, extra explosives to throw all 5 demo charges in one go, and then you use drive-by demolitions to give them +1 to hit and +1 to wound. That's 4 CPs on what was a 75-point unit, is now a 100-point unit. But that unit, Atalan Jackals, is pretty much not seen outside of taking the Biker Bomb, because they're not worth it if you just run them around with some shotguns. I've used them extensively. I have battle reports with me using Atalan Jackals outside of the traditional Biker Bomb to try and show off what they can do as not just a Biker Bomb, and they don't really do anything. they either get targeted straight away or they fly at the board and do no damage whatsoever and then die because they're only toughness 4 with a 5-up save. Sure, they've got a -1 to hit, but there's a lot of armies out there which don't really care about that. And they're no good in combat. They're a neophyte. They're slightly more difficult to kill neophyte. So, again, you have a unit. So we've given 2 examples there of units which can only really function based upon stratagems. And those, if you were to do both of those tactics, one on one turn, one on another turn, that would cost you 9 CP. Which is, again, just for 2 units, you're investing potentially at least half your CP, probably more like 2/3. So an incredibly CP intensive army as well. And being reliant upon stratagems is not a good thing, because you have factions out there like Dark Elder which can simply vect you, agents of vect, and they can just stop you from doing something absolutely vital to the success of your army. You know, you might have an aberrant bomb, or you would have done back until chapter approved, but you might have a close combat bomb where, you know, maybe it's metamorphs now after chapter approved, where you get them in, you perfect ambush them for them, and they tear everything to pieces in close combat. What happens when you go to use a perfect ambush to move d6 inches closer towards the enemy, and your opponent goes, "Vect"? Now your expensive close combat unit, you know, if we're looking at this historically, aberrants, you know, potentially a 300-point unit, or still relevant now with the decrease in rock source, acolyte bomb, 20 acolytes, all the rock source. It's a 200+ point unit, at least 10% of your army, more like, you know, 12% of your army. Just invalidated, because then you've got to make a 9-inch charge. If you're lucky, it's just only a 7-inch charge. If you're lucky, your key Death Star unit has a 50% chance of making it. And assuming, yeah, it's just another example of why having a Codex entirely reliant upon stratagems is a bit. So you can see there are some fundamental key weaknesses with the army. And the thing is that this is being reflected on the tournament scene as well now. Now, obviously, the tournament scene is massively skewed by Space Marines at the moment. We have to acknowledge that. We can't ignore it. We have to acknowledge that. Space Marine, but you have seen Genestealer Cult just drop off the tournament scene. At the upcoming, this weekend, Caledonian Uprising tournament, one of the more important tournaments in the UK, quite an old long-standing one, there was a single Genestealer Cult player there. One. There were like 20 odd Space Marine, out of the 80 players that are going, like 22 of them are Space Marines. So obviously they make up almost a quarter of all the players there. Fair enough. Like I said, we're not going to get drawn into that. But Space Marines do counter Genestealer Cult incredibly hard, because you have your things like your infiltrators, which deny people from deep striking within 12 inches of you. Well, that just completely neuters Genestealer Cult. You've got one of the most common factions at the tournament scene at the moment, Space Marines, with a very common unit, infiltrators. Everyone loves their Primaris infiltrators in Space Marine lists now. And those units just don't allow you to deep strike and charge with Cult. Just can't do it. And even if you do get in close, they have all spec scan, so they can just blow you away. Just blow you away. So you can see why Genestealer Cult have begun to drop off competitively, because they rely upon tricks and shenanigans, and unfortunately those are only short-term tactics you can draw upon. Eventually you need to switch to something more consistent. something which isn't matchup dependent. You know, oh, my Genestealer cult will absolutely massacre orcs. They've got nothing that can really stop me. But then if I go against Marines or Elder or something, I'm buggered. You need something that can be much more sustainable. And so, it's really interesting. It's really, for me, being a bit smug, it's really satisfying. And it's really interesting to see online the way the community is shifting, the Genestealer cult community is shifting, and with the way their tactics are shifting, and people are moving away from deep striking, close combat shenanigan tactics, and people are moving towards more reliable shooting tactics and mechanized tactics. And the reason why I'm very smug about this is because when I first looked at the Genestealer cult Codex, I talked about these issues before, but I said, this is not a close combat army. There's too many things that can stop you from getting off a good close combat assault. This is a submarine shooty codex. This is a close combat codex which actually is really good at shooting, a bit like orcs. And people have started recognizing that as well. So you see on forums like Daka Daka, which I know a lot of people don't like Daka Daka. They think of it as too much moaning and stuff. But whatever, we won't get into that now. I personally quite like Daka Daka. I like a lot of online forums. And what you see is people moving away from Cult of the Four-Armed Emperor, which gives you a +1 to your charge, and Twisted Helix, which gives you +1 strength. Moving away from those close combat cults and towards Hive Cult, the one that lets you get, and they move towards Hive Cult because you can get, because of the Stratagem, which is a very base stratagem, not CP. It's 2 CP +1 to hit against one enemy unit that you've wounded. It's basically overlapping fields of fire. And you've also got the Hive Cult Warlord trait, which allows you to your Warlord units in 6 inches of your Warlord to reroll 1s to hit when shooting, and that's shooting phase in Overwatch. So that's the people, and then the cult trait lets you fall back and shoot, albeit at a -1, and also you don't take morale casualties as well. Not really, anyway. They're like Valhallans. So people started moving towards those because the bladed cog allows you to move and shoot with heavy weapons at no penalty, and you've got some good stratagems and good warlord traits. They've got old grudges, their warlord trait, the bladed cog people, and everyone gets a 6-up invuln, which is great in this age of Marines and everyone having a million AP on all their weapons. Having a guaranteed 6-up save on all your infantry, which would normally only have a 5-up save, is really powerful. And likewise, having Hive Cult being able to have the best shooting in your codex is being seen as really powerful. However, the problem is that what you're doing, and I've spoken about this before, the problem is that what you're finding there is you're taking Genestealer cult and you're basically making them into Imperial Guard. And I did say, again, many of you will recall me saying this, I did say how, our Genestealer cult, can they outguard the Guard? Jury's still out on that. I think they do. They can at least can compete. They can offer alternatives. If you like the idea of Guard want to be a heretic, go for the Genestealer cult. But again, no one can completely outguard the Guard, because whilst neophytes might have loads of cool special rules, they are 50 points for a squad rather than 40 points. And when you're buying guardsmen and when you're buying chaff, a lot of the time you don't want the extra special rules, you just want the bodies for as cheap as possible. And so that's why weirdly guardsmen will often outdo neophytes, because even though man for man the neophytes might be slightly better, the guardsmen are turning up with extra bodies every single time, and first rank fire, second rank fire, it's as simple as it gets. But people are moving towards a shooting cult army and a mechanized army of all things. But then what you find is the final point I want to talk about with Genestealer cult. The final point, which is, if the Codex feels like it was written at the very beginning of 8th edition. Literally, it feels like it was one of the first codexes written, even though it was actually one of the last that was released. It feels like it was written at the beginning of 8th edition. And they sat on it for 12 months. And they sat on the first draft. It was in the bottom of someone's desk. And then they went, shit, right, we've got to release Genestealer Cult. They're a small faction, but you know they're pretty popular, pretty well known. We've got to release it. Right, take that 12-month-old draft out and update some bits quickly, but also add in loads of restrictions that ham-fist a load of restrictions in. You know, no, actually, you know what? Thinking about it now, it feels like someone wrote the first draft of the Genestealer Cult Codex at the very beginning of 8th, and then halfway through 8th, they when the Codex was being released, they updated it with a bunch of restrictions. Like, oh shit, yeah, restrict all that. And then at the end, they sort of tossed it. They updated at the very end before they released it. They updated the ambush mechanics and then threw the Codex out there. But there you go. Because you can clearly, it's really weird, right? The reason I say that is you can clearly see, like, the different stages of development. It's really obvious where they the first draft and the 6-month update and the 12-month 12-month rush and finish and send it out. Okay. Now and it reminds me, and I will get into the details in a minute. It reminds me of Duke Nukem Forever, the game Duke Nukem Forever, which took like 11 years for them to develop something crazy. And you can see Duke Nukem Forever. You can see that the first third of the game is like classic shooter, classic Doom. You're running around, you're blasting aliens, classic Duke Nukem. And then as the game, and then there's a bit where about the second third of the game, it becomes like a tactical shooter. Like you're having to like take cover, and cover becomes really important and all this kind of stuff. And then the final third of the game becomes like a sandbox where you're driving around in your car and everything. And you can see that obviously that was the first part of the game was developed in one era, the second part was developed in the second era, and the third part was developed in the last era. And it's the same with the Genestealer Cult Codex, right? So you have this weird thing where even though we were the last codex to be released, none of our vehicles benefit from the cult trait. What? No other codex had that restriction after, like, Marine, it was like Marines and Chaos and Grey Knights, and those early Marine codexes from the very beginning of 8, they had those restrictions on their chapter tactics. And then Games Workshop realized how silly that was. And, all subsequent codexes going forward, Guard being a good example, it's like, okay, yeah, your vehicles get your regiment traits as well. Okay, that was silly restricting it in that way. So it feels like, that was the first stage of development. They wrote the Genestealer Cult Codex. Yeah, your vehicles don't get it, blah, blah, blah. But then they never went back and updated it. They never checked that, it's like they never checked before they released it. Oh, yeah, no, we're letting everyone have regiment traits now. Yeah, no, that's fine. Let the Genestealer Cult vehicles have it. No, they never did it. Weird. And then 6 months down the line, when they were releasing things like the Tau Codex and they were balancing them, and they were saying like, okay, yeah, you've got to balance this. You can't have people spamming characters, with codexes. So you can only take one of each character per detachment. Yeah, that worked for Tau. So fuck it, we'll throw it in for Genestealer Cult. And it's like, but they only did that with a couple of codexes before they realised how much it felt like before they realised how redundant it was when they just released the rule of 3. And they never went back and fixed it for Tau, and they never checked to take that restriction out before Genestealer Cult was released. Do you see what I mean? So like you've got those. So Genestealer Cult has the restriction on the cult trait, the restriction on characters, and then it comes to releasing the codex, and they're like, oh, okay, shit, right. Well, let's update the ambush mechanic. That's the main thing. That's the main shtick for the codex. So we'll update the ambush mechanic. Hey, look, guys, you've got this cool new ambush mechanic. There you go. Here's your codex. And at first, when I got the codex, I was really excited and really happy about it because I was like, awesome! Look at all these cool tactics and tricks and stuff that cult can do. But And when people were like, and when I noticed these restrictions, I was simply like, oh, well, I just won't. I'll take 3 detachments. I just won't take Brood Brothers. They don't get the trait. I just won't take vehicles that much. I'll take a few because I like them, but that's it. And the thing is that what that meant was I was just missing out on whole parts of the Codex. Now, I don't take Cult Leman Russes. You know, why do Imperial Guard Leman Russes get a regiment trait, but a Cult one doesn't? How does that make sense? You know, though it's you can justify it sort of fluff wise, and I can't, you know, I'm like, oh, but they're not part of the cult. They've just been taken over by the cult. But that's not always the case, because not every Leman Russ that the cult uses is one that is being crewed by Brood Brothers. Often, Genestealer cults literally steal, more often than not, steal Leman Russes and Imperial Guard tech, and it is cultists driving the Imperial Guard tech, not Brood Brothers. It's cultists. So in that way, more often than not, the vehicle should get the trait. And there's no reason why there's nothing. If you go through these cult creeds, there's nothing there which makes them like pants on head, stupidly powerful when you apply them to vehicles. Honestly, I'll find some now, and it's like I'll find them now. It's near the back, isn't it? Here you go. So, calls the Four-Armed Emperor. Until the end of the battle round, first battle round, add 1 to advance and charge rolls made for units with this cult creed. Starting from the second battle round, if a unit with this cult creed is set up on the battlefield, then until the end of that turn, add 1 to advance and charge rolls made for that unit. Guess what? Doesn't affect vehicles. So why not just let vehicles have it? You know what that would be quite useful with? Rock grinders. That would be quite useful with rock grinders. No other vehicle's really going to take advantage of it, but at least rock grinders would benefit from it. Yeah? The Poor Princes. Reroll hit rolls for attacks made with melee weapons by a unit with this cult creed in a turn in which it made a charge move, was charged, or performed a heroic intervention. Again, doesn't really affect vehicles. But with the Poor Prince, you know, again, the rock grinder might benefit from it. But apart from that, that's not going to be a huge difference to the vehicles. But it might, you know, it might help. Hive Cult. If your unit with this cult creed fails morale test, halve the number of models that flee, rounding up. In addition, units with this cult creed can still shoot in turn which they fall back, but if they do so, must subtract 1 from their hit rolls. That's good. That actually does affect vehicles. That would be a really good one. And you know what? Fluff-wise, that makes total sense, because the Hive Cult are really militaristic, and they take advantage of loads of the... they take advantage of the... of all the military hardware that they've got, and they're really well disciplined. So having your vehicles be able to fall back and shoot at -1 would totally make sense for the Hive Cult. And it's at -1. It's not like they've got fly. Bladed Cog. All models with this cult creed have a 6 of Invan save. If you already have an Invan save, so your vehicles have a 6 of Invan save. In addition, infantry models with this cult creed do not suffer the penalty for the hit rolls for moving and shooting heavy weapons. So your vehicles get a 6 of Invan. That's actually quite useful. Wouldn't be broken though. It would just be quite... A 6 up Invan is never broken. You know, a 3 up Invan that you can spam for 2 points. Cough, Storm Shields. That's broken. Worsted Claw. When making saving throws for a model with this cult creed, add 1 to the result of the weapon being used to make the attack as an armor penetration characteristic of 0 or -1. That's like Armageddon Steel Legion. No one complains about Armageddon Steel Legion. Do they? No, they don't. Twitter Helix. Add 1 to the strength characteristic of models with this cult creed. In addition, add 2 to the advanced roll for this cult creed. Again, it's only 1. Strength isn't going to affect the vehicles. And adding 2 to the advanced rolls is only going to affect 1 unit, again, the Rock Grinder. So the point is that why have they got that restriction in place? Why did they have that restriction in place? It would only matter for a couple. It only affects a couple of creeds, but it really affects those creeds that it does affect. You just notice it. And this is the last thing I want to talk about. This is me going. I'm going to wrap the video up in the next 5 minutes. when I was using my cult, it was a very love-hate army to play. Very frustrating, but also sometimes very rewarding army to play. Because if you had a game with them where your opponent didn't really screen out, or didn't really have the ability to screen you out, and you were able to pull off all your shenanigans and stuff, it was very satisfying. But the moment you played against an opponent who knew what they were doing, who could screen you out relatively easily, it became an exercise of throwing men at them to try and slow them down, and then try and win by objectives, which wasn't really very satisfying. Wasn't really. You could argue that's very cult, sacrifice cults in the game. Yeah, maybe. But it can be very frustrating when your opponent just really easily just counters you. Really easily. I don't mind someone countering, countering my back and forth with tactics, but when their list just fundamentally counters you, and it's through no fault of your own, it's just that your army is just crippled by not being able to deep stroke within 12 inches. And so it was very frustrating. And so what I did is I ended up going back to my guard for a bit. I had my 6 months of using cult really often, and I loved them. And then I ended up going, and then I came back to my guard, and I've been riding my guard train, with the Mordians and this, for a while, on the painting front, and we've been using my Steel Legion nearly every week in my 40k games, at least every other week, and been doing that for the last few months. And I've come back to playing with Genestealer cult after, and it really feels like I'm playing with one hand tied behind my back. It really does. I've got my combat units, but they're just so susceptible in the current meta. Okay, I've got my shooting units, but all my vehicles don't benefit from my cult traits. So I want to take all these characters, but I can only take one per detachment. I want to try and fill the gaps in with Astra Militarum units, but I only get half CP for those detachments. I went to an event, the most recent event that I went to, not the most recent, maybe 3 events ago that I went to. I took my Genestealer cult, and I took two cult battalions and a Genestealer and an Astra Militarum battalion. I went to that, and because I was a bit rusty with my cult, I went that entire tournament without realising that my Astra Militarum detachment only gave me half CP, because no other army has that restriction. It totally, fortunately, it was it was only one day. It didn't matter. But I went that whole tournament with 3 CP more than I should have done. 2 CP more than I should have done. The whole tournament. It's not a huge difference. It's not a huge difference at all. I didn't win the tournament or anything. I wasn't ever the way I ran the army. It wasn't particularly CP intensive. I often had of CP left over at the end of the game. It wasn't a big deal. But the point is that you've got all these restrictions, and it really, when you go away and play an army like Guard and then come back to playing Genestealer cult, it's like fucking hell, I've heard some. This is the last thing I want to say. It's like I hear people say that Genestealer cult are a really cerebral army. They're really, you've got to be really, on it to win with cult. And I just like to, and maybe I am just stupid. Maybe I am just not physically clever enough to play Genestealer cult. However, I would like to think that that wasn't the case. Might not be true, but I don't like the fact that people say, "Oh, it's a really cerebral army." To me, that says convoluted, overly complicated. Okay, I shouldn't have to be. It's convoluted. Yeah, convoluted. And so that's so. And I know this video is going to come across very negative. I know it's not what people are going to be expecting. I don't want people to lose all enthusiasm for their army. I don't. Because I want, and this is how I'm going to wrap the video up. If you've made it this far, then this is the treat you get at the end of the video, which is Genestealer Cult are a really, really good army. And all the things that I have talked about now, okay, are annoyances. Okay, they're niggles. They're, you know, a little pin in the back of your hand. They're not a crippling wound to the army, not by a long shot. Genestealer Cult still boasts some of the best close combat capability in the entire 40k. Genestealer Cult will very easily outfight orcs in close combat. Very easily. Hybrid Metamorphs, 7 points for 3. Sorry, for 3 strength 4 attacks with Rend. Yeah, better than an orc boy. You know, say, and so they are fantastic. Genestealer Cult are a fantastic army. The fluff and lore behind them is brilliant. The fact that they're also one of the most customizable factions from a hobbying point of view. My Genestealer Cult still, even with my Mordian, my Mordian restoration project, my Genestealer Cult still remain my favourite hobby project I have ever done. My Brotherhood of Nods themed, just, they're so cool. And that's the thing about Genestealer Cult, they're so cool. And I'm sure there's a lot of competitive players out there which will be able to point out a lot of flaws in my arguments possibly. But my point is that they just have these weird restrictions on them. Okay, they just do, and I think the Codex needs looking at again. Okay, I don't think Games Workshop should tweak. This is the last thing I would say. Last thing I was going to say. I don't think if I was to fix Genestealer Cult, I don't think Games Workshop need to rewrite the whole Codex. Not by a long shot. I'd leave the ambush mechanic exactly the way it is. Blip deployment is so cool. Being able to just have armor-wide deep strike is very powerful. I wouldn't touch that. I wouldn't necessarily touch the stratagems either. Okay? Wouldn't necessarily touch stratagems. I'd maybe make some of them 1 CP cheaper. You know, the perfect ambush, it's a D6 roll. Okay, it shouldn't be it shouldn't be 3 CP for something that's so random. Okay, it should be 2 CP. So many armies, you know, there's so many factions out there now which can shoot again for 2 CP, not 3 CP. Come on. The first curse stratagem where it's like a random roll to get, you know, don't have a random roll. Just pick a benefit. Just pick a benefit. Reduce the randomness. Okay, reduce the randomness. Cult is not a random faction. Cults are very calculated. Okay, but the main thing that I think needs looking at is the way the cult traits work. Okay, I think every Genestealer cult trait should have 3 parts to it. Okay, 1 part should affect infantry. 1 part should affect vehicles, and the 3rd part should affect Genestealers. And that way the Genestealers would be worth the 15 points rather than, and we haven't even touched upon that the worst unit in the Genestealer Cult Codex is the Genestealer. That's sad. That's really fucked up. Excuse my language. The cult traits need reworking. Okay? Very, very simple. An example I would have, if we take the bladed cog, for example, I'd have the bladed cog, you know, everyone gets a 6-up influence save. That's the hybridized commandos. You can have in addition the infantry models with the cult creed do not suffer the penalty for their hit rolls for moving and shooting with heavy weapons. And then, you know, for the Genestealers, they should have maybe a 6-up feel no pain, just inbuilt to represent, you know, the bionics. Okay, Something simple. No one, honestly, no one cares about 6 up feel no pain. But it makes your Genestealers worth it. The Genestealers don't get, any other benefit. Hive Cult, you should be able to have your infantry models half the morale tests when fleeing, half the morale casualties. The vehicles everyone can fall back and shoot at -1. And the Genestealers, what could the Genestealers have? Well, they're really militaristic. Could you have it where could the Genestealers fall back and charge? Because they haven't got any guns. Something like that. Maybe that's too powerful to have fall back and shoot and fall back and charge in one place. I don't know. Pauper princes that real hit rolls made for attacks made with melee weapons by this cult creed. All that really needs is something for the vehicles. Can the vehicles provide some sort of morale bonus? I don't know. Because they're hanging all the banners off the side of them. I think the thing is that I think the reason why Games Workshop didn't apply these traits to the vehicles is because it was too difficult for them to come up with an easy solution, so they didn't bother. Maybe, or maybe they wrote the codex at the beginning of 8th and never made the amendment. I don't know. Quite frankly, I think the easy solution for them is just to say your traits now affect vehicles, go nuts. And then some cults will benefit more from vehicles than others, and that will be fluffy. Hive Cult, Bladed Cog, guess what? They're on either they're either on Astral Militarum worlds or they're on Skitarii worlds, Admech worlds. They're going to have access to a lot of hardware. And they're the ones that their vehicles would benefit the most from having cult traits. Think people like Poor Princes, they come from incredibly poor backgrounds. They haven't got any vehicles. They haven't got any hardware. Therefore, their vehicles aren't really going to benefit from it. Apart from the Rock Grinder, fine. One vehicle benefits from it. I can live with that. So there you go, guys. It's a long video. I know it's been kind of ranty and kind of negative. Hopefully you can appreciate that it's not been very salty, this video. It's just been an analysis of the frustrations of running Genestealer Cult. And I think they're all pretty valid. I think they're all issues that need to be addressed within the Codex. And I don't think that Games Workshop needs to overhaul Genestealer Cult massively. Because at the moment, because outside of these annoyances we've talked about being too CP intensive and not getting cult traits and being a little gimmicky, outside of that, they're a really good faction, really powerful and able to hold their own. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Is it too negative? Put that down in the comments below. Have I made a lot of valid points? Do you agree with them? And do you have any solutions for how you would just tweak the cult slightly, because they're just slightly off balance at the moment? And how would you regain balance with the Codex? Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and of course, I'll see you guys next time.